Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Talk with Lizzy podcast. I'm your host, Lizzy, and today we are back with another special guest. I say this every week, but I genuinely love all of our guests. This week's guest name is Rachel. She is a marine biologist, a Christian marine biologist who shares all about how Christianity and science work together, which is so much fun and so cool to talk about. And I think a perspective that more Christians and non-Christians need to understand. So I'm so excited to talk to her and to share her story and share some of the things that she's been learning and finding. So without further ado, I'll let her share her story. I'm so
Aw,
excited to have you today.
well, thank you. It's always something that I've wanted to try being on a podcast. So I'm really tickled that you said yes and that we get to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. I know I love when people like reach out because I'm like I it's it's something that like I never really thought of was having like the scientific perspective, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. And so
Well,
I was like, yes, absolutely.
aw, well, that's great. It's not, I guess it's not like a super, I don't know, in Christian circles, I don't feel like it's a very common perspective. I mean, it makes sense, right? Like there's not a ton of like fervent, devoted Christians who are also working as professional scientists at that moment who are actively talking about it. So I'm tickled that you were willing. And I hope to also bring to light some of the resources that I've found of Christian scientists who are actively talking about their faith and about the science so that your listeners have those to go off of too if they want to know more.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know. I love that you had like the courage to come and ask because I know sometimes like when I go to ask people, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous. But then, like, I mean, the worst you could say is no. And I'm not going to say no to someone wanting to come on because I'm like, yes, please. Like, I love having guests and hearing new perspectives because, like, my goal with the podcast is like, even people who aren't Christian, I'd love to have on to have like their stories. And so it's like, I really don't care like what your background is. I want to have people on to share like your story, what you do, because learning a new perspective on the world is such an important thing. So I'm really excited to
Yes.
have your perspective today.
Oh, thank you. That's something that really drew me to your podcast was this premise of your openness to any conversation, any story. That's kind of unusual and so refreshing because it was like, oh, this is a place where like I can feel comfortable and non-Christian friends could feel comfortable having a conversation and engaging over maybe some hard but good discussion. So that's awesome.
Thank you. Well, are you good if we just jump into questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Perfect. So, what is your testimony?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I guess I'll just kind of give you a frame of reference for where I am now, and then I'll kind of go back. So I am a Christian. I love the Lord. My story of how I came to know Him begins pretty early, but we've had quite the exciting time together, Jesus and me. So I am a professional marine biologist. It's what my background is in, specifically coral biology. So corals, the animal in the ocean that build our amazing reefs. And that's something that God called me to pursue pretty early on in life. And I have a master's degree in marine biology and ecology. I have a certification in biblical studies from Bodenseehoff Bible College, which is this amazing international school. And I just love talking about faith and science. And I'm so tickled that you're game to talk about it with me. This is going to be great. So my testimony, my story with Jesus begins back when I was, I think, like 4 or something really early. So I grew up in a Christian home, Christian family. My parents loved the Lord. And so I'm really blessed in the sense that I don't remember a time in my life when Jesus wasn't in it in some capacity. There were always people talking about him. I went to Sunday school, all the things. And strangely enough, I don't actually remember the moment I became a Christian. My mom does. She says we were in the car and I said that I wanted to be a Christian. I wanted Jesus to be the Lord of my life and come and live in my heart and transform my life and lead me, and which is a big decision for a 4-year-old to make. Like just to acknowledge that. Like that's, if people doubt that, I understand why. But it was authentic because it's really had a massive impact on major and even a lot of the minor steps I've made in my life. So um, that was a moment. And I started realizing when I was about 13 years old that something was a little amiss. Like I was going to church with my family, I was reading my Bible off and on, I was, doing all the church checklist things that I think cultural Christianity tells us we should do. And I was going to school and spending time with my non-Christian friends. Most of them were very, very strong non-Christians and they had amazing questions. And I'm honored that they felt comfortable enough to ask me. And they really challenged my faith in some really good ways. So I would come home with questions and have to try to dig through, what is the answer to this? Is there an answer to this? How do we make sense of this stuff? And so I'm really grateful to my non-Christian friends because they definitely catalyzed my understanding. So I began to notice when I entered my teens that my relationship with God needed to be independent of my parents. It needed to be my own faith. I couldn't just piggyback off of somebody else's. And that's partly why when I graduated high school, I made the decision to take a year off, go to Bible college, study for a little while, and be away from home in a really different setting. I was in Germany, so long distance,
Yeah.
and just immerse myself in the theology and in the Bible and really decide, is this what I'm going to spend the rest of my life thinking, believing, putting my hope in for myself? And that was a firm yes. I went into it all very open-minded, like, this, my mind might completely change. And I came out of Bible college really just deeply loving Jesus, and it very much grew my relationship with him. So very grateful for that time. And then since that, it's just been kind of just life. And the marine biology route really kicked in after that gap year. And it's just been a steady stream of like making a decision via checking in with God and being like, okay, is this what you want me to do? Is this the right thing? Is this where you're leading? And if it's not, he slams the door and I move on to the next one. And prayerfully, I'm like, okay, God, how about this? Like, is this the next thing? And it's amazing the doors that have opened that I've gotten to walk through and just follow his leading on. So that's my story.
That's awesome. I've gotten to talk to some people about, yeah, who have like a story from, very young being knowing Jesus. And I love that you said like there wasn't really a time in my life where I didn't have Jesus. And I think that that is just so cool because I think a lot of people are worried to share their testimony if they've known Jesus their whole life because they're like, oh, well, like I don't have a crazy testimony and no one's gonna like find it important. But it's like, no, like it's a testament to God's faithfulness that he's been there since you were that little
Yes.
to now. And like, how amazing is it for you to be able to say, yeah, I've known Jesus like my whole life. Like that's so
Yeah, it's so special. I very much grew up feeling what you described of like, oh, my testimony is inferior to that of others because it's not exciting. It's pretty boring. And I think it's really, in some ways it's almost, I think, easier to doubt and pick apart. It's like, oh, you became a Christian when you were a kid. Like, how valid even is that? Have you really weighed things since? Which is an excellent question that I think everybody should be asking who has a story similar to mine. But you're right. It's really a privilege to be like, wow, I've been so blessed. Like what a gift that I didn't have to search far and wide, that I was exposed to truth so early, and that I didn't have to struggle the way some other people have to. Like there's beauty to every form of testimony, to everybody's story,
cool.
and we don't need to compare them. Like God can use anyone, any story, and in any which way. And we see that in the Bible over and over again, like all these various testimonies. Some people that came to know the Lord really young, and some were really old, and others were like back and forth. And
Yeah.
pretty much everybody at some point struggled in their walk with God. So that's a tremendous encouragement. Everybody's story matters.
Yeah. I always say like even though and also even you have like this testimony, you have like your whole life, right? But then you also have these little stories in there that like add to it. And so like
Yes.
even if you don't want to share like your huge story because you feel like it's boring, I bet you have like some story in there that's pretty interesting. So
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's really hard to sum up the big story of your life when, it's the all those little moments connected together. Like it's hard to sum that up. There's just a lot to it.
yeah. So well, you said you were into science from a very young age. Do you kind of want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, sure. So kind of weirdly similar to how I came to know Jesus, I came to know marine science. So my parents used to take our family to the coast, the West Coast, like
Oh
Washington,
yeah, West
Oregon.
Coast, West Coast.
It's so beautiful. It's probably always going to be my favorite just because of the nostalgia factor. It's the ocean I first fell in love with.
I live in
So we would make
Washington, so.
Yes. Oh, it's so beautiful. That's where I went for undergrad was in Seattle and
Oh,
just
cool.
such beautiful landscape. Um, so we would make trips out there like once a year and uh my parents are just they're into exploring things and so they taught me when I was really young to play in the tide pools and like that you could poke the sea anemones and don't touch the jellyfish and all that stuff. And I loved it. It was my playground. It was so special, and I always knew that I liked it. I just really thought it was cool. Um, I sort of got talked out of thinking about it in terms of a job. I had a interview project when I was in sixth grade where you're supposed to interview someone in a job that you were interested in. I interviewed a marine biologist who I didn't have a personal connection with. He was willing to let me ask him some questions, and he really shot it down. It's like, this if you're it was kind of the standard, like if you're not good at science, like you probably shouldn't do it. It's a lot of school. It's really hard. And so I just sort of like extinguished that dream and moved on with my life and was thinking about other things. And then when I was in my 10th grade biology class, it was the second day of school, and my red-haired teacher, Mr. McCormick, who's just such a character. I adore him to bits. He was infamous for going off on these tangents in class, and he was supposed to be talking about cell biology or glucose or something, and he starts talking about corals and coral bleaching and this research on how sunlight affects corals that he did back when he was in graduate school. And I was so mesmerized by what he was saying. I was hanging on his every word. And after school, when my mom picked me up, she, did the standard, like, how was your day? And I just started gushing about this coral stuff that Mr. McCormick had told us. And I got so excited that I started crying, just tears. And I don't normally cry when I'm like really happy. But I was just over the moon, excited, just crying. And my mom very memorably said, "Wow, you really love this. Maybe you should remember that." And I did. And that was kind of the moment where I was like, I want to do coral. Like I don't know what that looks like, but I want to do coral biology. I want to do coral work. I guess that means I'm going to be a marine biologist. And so from there on out, it was sort of, okay, what steps do I need to take to pursue that and do it? Because it just felt so clear that God had placed this really intense passion in my heart for corals and to really understand them and know them, which some people I think personally get that. Like they have a thing that just really lights a fire under their bum and they're ready to go chase after it. And I don't think that's super common. I think some people have that, and other people just they have a lot of things that they like, and that's awesome. But in my case, it was a really clear, like, oh, this is the thing, and I feel really compelled by it. And like I was saying earlier, when I pursued the doors that led that direction, God opened them and closed others. So it's just really incredible how that's worked out. So that's a bit about how I got into choral.
That's so cool. I think that's so interesting. And I have specific questions to ask you today, but I might have to have you come on again and we can talk about coral. 'Cause I'm really
You're so
interested in
sweet.
learning about coral.
That's awesome. Well, I've got a whole bunch of resources on my Instagram. I'm sure you've seen. I'm thinking I should probably do a segment on corals at some point
Yes.
to just
But
like educate people. And there's a ton of resources out there already that would just be so easy to share. So keep an eye out.
yes, I
Would be
will.
fun.
That's awesome. I will also put your Instagram in the like
Oh,
description
cool.
of the podcast so that
Great.
people can go follow you.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. So why is it important that science and Christianity go together?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So God created both. And actually I'm going to pull a quote from this book, God Speaks Science. It's by John Van Sloten, came out pretty recently. Van Sloten is a pastor, theologian, and sort of a amateur scientist. I can tell he's really done his research. But he writes in this book just this really cool concept about how the Bible is a book by which we can come to know God, but there is a second book, and this is what he says. We know God by two means. First, by creation, preservation, and government of the universe, since that universe is before our eyes like a beautiful book in which all creatures, great and small, are as letters to make us ponder the invisible things of God. And he goes on to say, all these things are enough to convict humans and to leave them without excuse, quoting from Romans 1:20. Second, God makes himself known to us more clearly by his holy and divine word, so the Bible. And I love that because I feel like it sums up my philosophy as a Christian and as a scientist, that science and Christianity go together because of God. He created them, and he created the natural world, creation, which is the thing that science studies, as a means for us to know him better. So in the same way that we can go to the Bible and read stories about God and see this epic overarching narrative of who he is and what he's done and what he promises he's going to do, we can look at creation and see evidence of his character, kind of his fingerprints, things that show us his loving kindness and his creativity and his sense of humor and all sorts of different things. So that's why I get so excited about it. It's really important that they go together. I also think it's an aspect of the world that often gets neglected in Christian circles. I think it's really easy for the church to kind of talk around this science instead of talking, like engaging in it. It's hard to understand, like if you're not scientifically inclined, it's difficult. I want to acknowledge that, but I think it's so important that the church engages in conversations with scientists and in the really cool, amazing science that's actively happening, because it's a way of knowing God and it's a way of pointing scientists to see God that they might not witness him any other way. The natural world is the Bible they are reading, if
Mhm.
not the actual Bible. So it's a way of getting to know him more.
That's so cool. I love how you said that. I think I also think that's why a lot of people when they get into like being outside and going outdoors, that's when they feel closest to God. Like
Yes,
my
yeah.
boyfriend, he always tells me that. He's like, Lizzy, whenever we go and we go camping or we go do something like hiking, I feel so much
Mm,
closer to him than any other time. And so I think that uh really explains why that happens, is it being like you get to see his work, like you get to
yes.
experience it and know it. And I think adding in that extra layer of like the science aspect of it adds so much to that. So I think
Mm,
that's beautiful.
that's really cool. Is there a place that you feel closest to God, like setting wise, like a particular spot where you're like, wow, it's just so easy to connect with his presence here?
I wouldn't say that there's a specific spot that I feel closest to God, but I will say when I feel closest to God, my mind goes back to a certain spot, if that makes sense.
Oh,
So
yeah, it does.
last year I went to school in Virginia, And so I was in Virginia and I literally across the country from my family, didn't come home for
Yeah.
Easter because it's only a short little break. And so I had a friend who invited me to go to Good Friday service and then Easter service. And
Oh,
every single time it was amazing. She's so sweet, love her. And every single time now that like I truly feel very close to God, my mind goes back to Easter Sunday outside. We were worshiping God just in the backyard of this because it's a home church. So it's like
oh, yeah.
so every time my mind goes right back there. And so I'd say I don't necessarily have a spot where I go to feel closest to God, but when I feel closest to God, I go back to that spot, if that makes sense.
That's so sweet. Yeah, it does. That's really beautiful.
Yeah, it was
It's
so
like I just wonder what the spiritual landscape looks like. Like
right.
I I just wonder, because I wonder if there's a representation of that, you know, on a spiritual level that because what
Yeah,
you're describing makes total sense.
right.
That's beautiful.
And I love that you talk about that you just mentioned that too, because I think a lot of times we assume like scientists, they don't believe in like the spiritual. And so I think that's also a
Mm.
big um thing that separates Christianity from science a lot of times is the idea that like, oh, if you're a scientist, you don't believe in any sort of like spiritual stuff. It's all physical. So do
Mm.
you actually, I know I did not put that in the questions, but do you want to
Oh,
speak?
yeah, we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's sort of two common in my experience, there's sort of two common paths that if not Christianity, that a lot of my scientific friends kind of walk down one of these two paths. So the one is the one that you described of the really strong naturalism, like the physical world is everything, and there isn't any meaning beyond that. It's just it is what it is, basically. I think we're all fairly familiar with that belief. Um, and that I think oftentimes and this is a generalization, but when I get in deeper conversation with those friends and we start, I'm sharing my faith, and if they're willing to engage on that, which most of them are, which is really incredible, they ask some of the most penetrating and insightful questions, and I've just had some really incredible, respectful conversation on that, and they're very oftentimes, when you're vulnerable, they're willing to be challenged too. And for a lot of those instances where I've had that kind of conversation, I think their decision to just believe that everything is physical, like a really naturalistic point of view, often stems from they got they got hurt by religion at some point in their lives, whether it was just through studying history and looking at the horrible crusades and massacres that have happened in the name of religion, Christianity specifically, or they personally grew up in a setting where they experienced really intense harm at the hand of a Christian. Like those stories have impacted the direction they've taken. One of my friends in particular, I really like this quote. He said that the evidence for God seems compelling, but he can't fathom a way in which a God who made all things and and is sort of the has the power that Christianity describes. He can't fathom how a God like that could possibly be good. And he would rather choose to believe in no God at all than believe that there is an evil God, which I just think that sums up a sentiment that a lot of people have experienced. I really respect that. It's hard to grapple with, you know, is there God? If there is, okay, what is God like? What even is that? Like that's a really big thing to explore. So that's kind of one train of thought. And then the other path that I see a lot in sort of my scientific friends, the scientific thinking is almost the exact opposite. It's like an overemphasis on spirituality. And these are the people who will very often comment, like, there's no way there's not something bigger than us out there.
Mhm.
For them, everything is very spiritual. These are the people who keep crystals in their window, who pray, but they don't really know what they're praying to. They're more likely to dabble in like the occult or kind of stranger type spirituality. And so it's like an emphasis on over spiritualizing things. And I say over spiritualizing not because I don't think everything is indeed spiritual. I think the spiritual world is very much overlaid on top of our own. But I think they are approaching the spiritual realm without the confidence and understanding given to us by the Holy Spirit, and they're engaging in that realm without really knowing what's up. And I think they're more likely to encounter some dangerous things. So those are kind of the two routes that I see a lot in science. The people who are like, just I don't want there to be a God, so there's not. I'm just going to decide that there's not, and I'm going to look for evidence of that and be a little bit uncomfortable if any of it comes up. And then there's the people who look around and they're like, no, everything's got to be spiritual. And how do I make sense of that? I'm just going to try all these different things and kind of see what works. So those are kind of the two general camps that people fall into, I think.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I really enjoyed like understanding the how a lot of those people are hurt from church and hurt from God, or not actually hurt from God, but like they attribute it to God.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
because I definitely see that a lot. And also I see the people who are totally off on their own spiritual path, and it's so sad because it's like you understand, but you don't understand it fully. Like you understand that there is a spiritual realm, but you aren't you're not quite there. And it's like hard to see because it's like you're actually going down a path that's really dangerous. And
Hmm.
so I have a friend that is that way. And so it's always hard for me. And I tried, like, we have great conversations. She's one of the people that all through high school, her and I have had, she's probably the reason that I love to have people on who have different conversations or who have different
Aw.
stories because we would just talk. We were on cheer together and we would just have these lengthy conversations that just dealt with all opinions of everything. And we probably agreed on be nice to other people. And that was probably um, but and so I got to hear that perspective, and I tell her about how I believe in the spiritual realm, but not the way she does. And it's hard because you're like, oh, I just want you to like know God. I just want you, but I'm also like trying to understand you better too. I'm not trying to just push it on you. So
Yeah,
finding
that's
that,
a tough line to walk sometimes as a friend. First of all, I think it's beautiful that you have people in your life who you love dearly, who have dramatically different beliefs than you. I think that's really healthy. And I think that's part of our calling as Christians is to engage with people who are really different than us,
Mhm.
not because we're trying to convert them, but because we're supposed to love them. And it sounds like you really love your friend well. And then I just think it's really, really cool that you are in relationship with her and you're more intent on being understanding than you are on being understood. And because of that, you're able to connect at a deeper level and have those complex conversations. That's so valuable.
um, and so my next question is could you talk about evolution? Because I saw you did some serious stuff on your Instagram, but I'd love to like hear it
Yeah,
straight from like talking to you. So if you want to share a little.
yeah, sure thing. So like you said, I've got a whole bunch of resources on my Instagram. I also have a pamphlet available on my website that you can check out. I can send you the link for that and you can put it in the
Please do.
caption too if you
That'd be
want. Yeah, so it's a 8-page pamphlet that I created answering the question, can faith and science coexist? And specifically answering the question, can Christians believe in evolution and still be Christians? So to kind of break it down, and I'll approach the evolution question from like the scientific standpoint of what it is in a nutshell, and then how it connects to Christianity. And I'll try to be brief.
great.
So evolution defined is change over time. That's it. That's what it means. It just means change over time. That's why we hear the word used in non-scientific settings too, like, oh, my personality's evolved throughout the course of my life. Like it's changed over time. Um, Evolution has kind of some key points to it. And I feel like these are trigger words for a lot of people who maybe haven't really sat themselves down and tried to learn the science from people who are credentialed and able to actually teach the science. So if you want a deeper understanding of kind of how evolution works, I would direct you to some of those resources, like on my Instagram or my website. But there's kind of this, not kind of, there is this misconception in Christianity that you can't believe in evolution and know and love God too. And it's just not the case. It's not true. Um, Felicia Masonheimer, she's the lead of Every Woman a Theologian, which is this phenomenal ministry. She talks about how there are almost different tiers of issues in Christianity. There's sort of like the primary tier issues, and these are what we might call in Christianese salvation issues. Like these are the make or break things. You have to believe these things in order to be a Christian. And one of them is creationism. You have to believe that God created all things in order to be a Christian. If you don't hold that belief, you're not actually a Christian. You might call yourself by that title, but you're not subscribing to Christian core beliefs. That is a first tier issue. It's make or break. You have to believe that in order to be a Christian. And then there's secondary and tertiary issues, which are sort of more peripheral, non-real issues. Like there are areas where there's room for disagreement. And even further out, we get to the realm of preferences. So these are things like, what kind of worship music do you like to jam out to? Do you like to sit or stand when you pray? Like those kinds of things we know that those aren't make or break for our salvation. So the secondary, tertiary issues, I would sort of slot the evolution conversation in somewhere around that point. It's not make or break as long as that creationism piece is in place. So you have to believe that God created all things, but you can believe that God created all things, but that he chose to do it through change over time, through evolution. And you can still be a Christian and love God and believe that he created everything with phenomenal design and goodness and meaning, and also subscribe to kind of the main modern scientific beliefs of our day. So that's kind of in a nutshell how I approach evolution as a Christian. Bit about the conversation. There's actually, interestingly, 4 different kinds of creationism. I think most people think there's only like 1 or 2. But there's young Earth creationism, which I think is the kind that gets talked about the most, which is a literal interpretation of Genesis 1. God created the world in 7 days. He created out of nothing, here's sort of step by step in Genesis how it happens. And then we have everything else. So that's young Earth. And then there's old Earth, which syncs with the scientific estimates of the Earth's age by saying, oh, maybe there's a gap between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis, a gap of thousands, millions of years. And that's kind of how they explain it. So they're like, okay, God created in 7, not really 7, so like they kind of work with it that way. And there's progressive creationism, which changes the interpretation of the word day into epochs or periods. And then we've got kind of the furthest along we've got evolutionary creationism, which is the idea that God created all things, believes that Genesis 1 is true, but that you have to rely on a more figurative interpretation of it than like a straight literal, a day means a day type meaning. It really emphasizes going back to the original Hebrew text, and it matches with modern science. And it doesn't, I say matches with modern science, not in that it's trying to shove creationism and evolution together. That's never going to be a safe thing to do, is to like shove Christianity and science and like, we're going to make this work. Like that's never a good idea. But what it does do is it says, okay, while trying to interpret the Bible correctly, like as correct and accurately as we possibly can, and really get the context and the meaning, and like what is God trying to teach us through this, while doing that, we can look at modern science, which there's a lot of evidence for evolution, and it's very compelling. And is there room to believe the evolution stuff while acknowledging that the Bible is true and God is sovereign and creator? Yes, there is. So we can do both. Um, I think it's very likely that the science is going to change. Science is always changing as we learn more, grow more. That shouldn't frighten us. That's part of its process. But the Bible, Christianity, that stuff doesn't change. That's rock solid. But we should constantly be trying to grow an understanding of it and deepen our relationships with Christ. So when we come to the evolution conversation, I just want to encourage people to really do the work. If you're a Christian, do the work to understand what evolution is and explore it. And it's okay if you're a little bit scared. I used to be really scared of it too, but have the conversations, do the work, learn it really well, and know that your faith is not at stake. You can explore science and love the Lord, and those things are not mutually exclusive. You can have the cake and eat it too. Can I ask you a question? I'm kind
Yeah.
of curious. If you're comfortable sharing, I'd kind of love to know what you think in terms of like how do you think the world was created? Like, do you align more with
Ooh.
like the old Earth, young Earth, progressive, evolutionary? Like, what kind of creationism do you feel is the most compelling? At least right as of right now. You can always change your
Right.
mind.
Yeah. I would say currently that
Mhm.
the first one you said was the younger Earth, right? Where it was like a
Yeah,
literal
yes.
7 days. Yeah, that's
Hmm.
what. So my dad, he's a huge, like, okay, it's really funny because he always is like, if you knew me in high school, you'd never understand how I am today. But he he's a big nerd about like the Bible and about all that stuff. So we ascribe to Answers in Genesis, or subscribe, not ascribe, subscribe to Answers in Genesis. He has so many like DVDs and books and stuff that he loves to do research on that kind of thing. And so we have over on that side of the room, so I'm not gonna go grab it, but we have these books called it's like Answers to Teen Questions. And I think it's from Answers in Genesis. And they have a few of the questions are about like dinosaurs and about evolution and that kind of thing. And they're really cool.
Mm.
I actually think I should probably do like some sort of podcast thing about them because I really enjoyed reading them when I was in high
Oh,
school.
cool.
But it talks about, yeah, the literal 7 day creation. And so we've always kind of talked about that. Um, and I remember we had these movies that were really cool. I can't remember what they're called. I could probably find them downstairs somewhere. But it was like where you would like travel back in time with the guy, and then it would like he would go and talk about the history and the science of like biblical
Oh,
things.
cool.
So I would say definitely that for now, but like I feel like I haven't done my own research because it's a lot of what like he
Mm.
said. And I mean,
Yeah,
not saying like, I'm just trying to go exactly with what he said because we disagree on quite a few things, but like, I
it's a
just
great
learned
starting
a lot.
point.
So yeah, so I'd say
Yeah,
definitely not for now, but I'd love to like learn more and that kind of thing.
that's awesome. Yeah, something that I almost feel silly saying it because I'm so used to the scientific conversation where like this is so ingrained in us as scientists. Like you go to the source to learn the thing. Like if you want to know about, I don't know, like how to cook the best brownies ever, like you would go to a professional baker or you'd go to like someone's grandma who's been cooking them for at least like, 50 years and makes them amazingly. Like you wouldn't ask somebody who hates brownies for a brownie recipe, right? And it's the exact same thing with Christianity and science. Like if you want to know about Christianity, you should probably be talking to the people who have really researched it and even believe in it and have those conversations. And if you want to learn about the science, you should probably be engaging with the scientists and looking at the scientific information. And I think a lot of the times, I sure know I was like this when I was younger. I got my information about science from biased sources that were kind of intent on putting it in a certain light and not necessarily trying to get to the truth of it. So I think it's awesome that you have some starting resources to work off of, but really cool that you're open to like engaging with other information, because that's the best way to get at what the truth actually is,
Right,
which is what Christianity endeavors to do. Like it wants truth. Like we want God, and God is the capital T truth,
right,
right? And science is all about trying to get at the truth of the natural world, and like it's always trying to get as close towards that as it possibly can, empirically rather than philosophically.
right.
So that's awesome.
Yeah, and I think it also like it's interesting because I grew up in public school system in Washington State, very like anti God. Um, and so it's been interesting to see like I don't see a lot of the middle ground things as much,
Mm,
but like I'll get from my dad very like like I was talking about like very much the 7 day creation. Um, Whereas like at school, I was getting like the pure evolution, like Darwinism.
yeah.
And so not really seeing an in between, not really understanding if there even was an in between of those two things. So I think it's really cool that you say that because I now like have an idea of some more of that stuff when really all I was taught were these two things and I understood I didn't
Yeah.
like this and I liked this and you know, and so
Yeah.
it's really cool.
Well, I hope it's a pleasant surprise to find out that you have more options. That's awesome.
Well, I definitely like want to research it because I'm like my dad in that aspect. I love to do like the research. I love to read. I'll
Mm,
we're very that's something I definitely inherited from him. No offense to my mom, but
that's great.
I got that from it. Um, so what are some cool facts about marine biology that you think we should know?
Ah, yes. Okay. Well, for one, 71% of the Earth's surface is water, specifically salt water, not including fresh water. So most of our planet, so the places that we spend most of our time is in the minority of what our planet actually is. It's very special. Um, and I think the second kind of like thing that I would be distraught if someone came away from a science conversation with me and did not know this, so I'll make a point of mentioning it. But corals, like the stuff that makes up coral reefs, corals are animals. They are not plants. They are not rocks. They are animals by the definition, which is weird because they look more like a rock and they function more like a plant, but they're very cool animals capable of amazing things. So that's another cool marine biology fact.
That's awesome. I always thought like well, I kind of always knew it, not always because obviously you have to learn at some point. But like for a lot of my time, I've known it was an animal, but I've always found it like interesting because I'm like, yeah, when you look at it, you're like, that's not what are you talking about?
Yeah, they're really strange.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're
fascinating.
also, yeah, you know how in Christianity we talk about the Trinity and how like Jesus, the Son, the Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost, and God the Father are individuals, but they're also corporate. Like it's a Trinity, it's three in one, and how it's a little bit of a confusing concept. Well, a coral is kind of a not a metaphor, but like it's similar in the sense that it's multiple in one. So corals are composed of polyps, and each polyp is shaped like a little flower. And some of them are really big. They're like, you know, at the size of a quarter or larger, and some of them are tiny. They're like the size of your pinky fingernail or smaller. Some of them you basically have to get out a microscope to really see them. And each of those polyps by itself is an animal, but when you connect all the polyps together to get the actual like rock looking formations that a coral is, when we talk about a coral, it's still just a coral. You don't say it's a collection of polyps. A coral is a polyp is an animal, and 1,000 polyps put together is still just one coral animal, which is
Wow.
so strange to me. But it's because of how they function. They function so corporately as a little society. They share resources. They connect their skin tissues so that they can exchange materials. They communicate. They communicate chemically, and they feed each other, and it's fascinating. So
So cool. I had no idea.
yeah, the
That's amazing.
natural world is a great way to like get a better understanding of kind of how you can wrap your mind around some of the theology, I think.
That's awesome. I also, I can't remember how he explains it. Let me see if I can find it. But in the book Seeking Allah Finding Jesus, he explains um the Trinity. Sorry, I'm like looking it up as I say
Oh
this.
yeah, no, you're good.
I'm trying to figure out, trying to remember how he explained it. Um, I don't know if I'll actually be able to find it on here. I can't remember, but oh, here we go. Maybe. He explained it as um. Okay, I'll just read it, I guess.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, Projected in the front of the room were three large depictions of nitrate in bold black and white. We were studying resonance, the configuration of electrons in certain molecules. The basic concept of resonance is easy enough to understand, even without a background in chemistry. Essentially, the building block of every physical object is an atom, a positively charged nucleus orbited by tiny negatively charged electrons. Atoms bond to one another by sharing their electrons, forming a molecule. Different arrangements of the electrons in certain molecules are called resonance structures. Some molecules, like water, have no resonance, while others have three resonance structures or more, like the nitrate on the board. Although the concept was easy enough to grasp, the reality proved to be baffling. Mrs. Adamaski concluded her lesson by commenting, "These drawings are just the best way to represent resonance structures on paper, but it's actually much more complicated. Technically, a molecule with resonance is every one of its structures at every point in time, yet no single one of its structures at any point in time."
Yes.
And so that's how he ended up explaining the Trinity, was that it was like that. And so I think it's so cool when we're able to explain biblical things through science. And
Yeah,
I
and
also,
just have principles for illustrating what it looks like. Because the reason the molecule is like that is because it's those electrons are spinning so rapidly and the atoms like buzzing, bouncing around. But yeah, it makes for a really cool metaphor with the Trinity. That's awesome.
yeah, and so I that was like my first real taste of like seeing science and the Bible like be
Mm.
together. And so I thought that was so cool. It's honestly, no matter what your like background is, you should read that book because it honestly is it's like my favorite book. Mind blowing.
Aw.
He's a devout Muslim who through conversations with his Christian friend ended up also becoming Christian. And he's unfortunately passed away now, but like that book is, it's really
What was the book called?
good. Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus.
Oh, okay. I feel like I've heard of that. I will have to check it out.
Good.
I will definitely do that. Thank
Yeah.
you for the recommendation.
Yeah.
I love book
And now I'm like,
recommendations.
I have all yours now too. Like,
That's awesome.
what are your well, obviously we kind of talked about how coral's one of your favorites, but what are your favorite scientific topics? And can you just talk on them for a second?
Oh yeah. Favorite scientific topics. Well, corals are definitely up at the top of the list. And honestly, the faith and science conversation, we've already like hit on the two biggest,
Yay.
like most central
I
things for me. Like I love this stuff so much.
feel like
Because
that
like
means I did a good job with the questions.
yeah,
I
you
take that a
you
huge
aced
compliment.
it. I read through the questions you sent me in advance and I was like, wow, it's like this, she doesn't even know me and she's nailed it. Like this is great. So thank you. Um, I guess I would just say, so I get a lot of questions in my line of work about, how do you become a marine biologist? Is it okay if I just like chat
Yeah,
about that for a sec?
absolutely.
Um, so one of my favorite like goofy stories to tell was I was working in the field. So I was working my previous job, I was the coral biologist for Dry Tortugas National Park. So I was basically a park ranger who wore a neoprene wetsuit and drove boats and did scuba diving. Like
That's
that's
cool.
what my job was. It was super cool. It was really hard. And every day I'd come back from the field. having gone diving, I'd dock the boat and be unloading my gear, and we would be right by the campground, and all the campers would come over and ask us questions, and my team and I would be trying to do our jobs, but also be trying to be polite and engage in conversation with people. And that was usually when I got asked the question by parents who were there with the kids camping, my son, my daughter wants to be a marine biologist. How do they get into it? And I remember this one lady in particular, she made it, just from her manner, it was so evident that like she wanted a lucrative job for her son, and wanted him to go to what I'm assuming to be probably a pretty prestigious school and whatnot. And she came over and she was like, which school does my son need to go to in order to get a job like yours? Like, tell me which school. Like, she wanted a checklist of like, you do X, Y, and Z. And it hit me of like, there is no one way. Like, there really is no one way. I have a master's degree in the subject. I did it that way, but most everybody else on the team that day who I was working with, they went to undergrad and they did a bunch of unpaid internships and built up their experience, and they have like a stronger resume than I do in a lot of different ways. And so I just would really encourage anybody out there who's interested in marine biology, who's like, how do you even get into that? Um, I would just start by saying, like, don't let anybody talk you out of it. When I was in sixth grade, that guy who very kindly let me interview him kind of talked me out of it for a while. But if you love it, if it's really what you want to do, just go for it. There's 1,000 different routes leading to marine biology jobs. So just start down a path, start down a path of trying to get to know the ocean, connecting with people who are already doing it. I am available if somebody has questions and wants to contact me directly. You can contact me through my newsletter. I've got a newsletter sign up on my website. You can reply to the next newsletter I receive, and I'll write you back, and we can dialogue about it. But yeah, it's a really um, it's a really hard career path. It doesn't always pay the best. You work a lot of long hours, and not everybody gets to go scuba diving every day. A lot of it's just, computer time, or you're teaching or something like that. But it's a very worthwhile job. It's really worth doing. And we need more people to do it, because the ocean's a really big place and there's a lot about it that we don't know. And there's a lot of problems related to the ocean that are coming up and getting worse. So we need smart problem solvers and people who love the ocean to study it and get really good at that area so that we can help it out. Um, yeah,
That's
that's
awesome.
kind of my
I
input on it.
love that you shared that because I always try to, I forgot to put it on the questions, but I try to normally be like, okay, if they have like a certain career, like how do you get into that? So I'm really glad you touched on that when I didn't actually end up putting that question in. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, what do you think, what is one thing you feel like all Christians should know about science, and what's one thing you feel like all scientists should know about Christianity?
Ooh, yeah, really good questions. All right, what should Christians know about science? Um, Science is not something to be afraid of. It's not something to fear. Um, just get to know it. Like, do the work, do the research. If I feel like a lot of the time Christians, the church, kind of looks at science with a little bit of trepidation. And I want to validate that because I've been there, I've had those feelings, but at the same time, um, they're unfounded. And we talk about our faith being able to overcome adversity, and I would just really say, like, if your faith is as rock solid as you say it is, then it's not going to be threatened by exploring something that's different than what you believe. Like, you're allowed to go and research other things just to get to know it and see. It doesn't mean you have to subscribe to it. It doesn't mean you have to get converted. It doesn't mean anything. You can explore that, and you can do it with the leading of the Holy Spirit. You can do it while engaging in prayer, while taking Jesus with you, while talking with Father God. You can do all that at the same time. So that would be the first thing I'd say to Christians is like, get to know the science. Please don't be afraid of it. It's really cool. And we're missing out on an amazing opportunity to know God better by not engaging with it.
Right. Well, it's so important. Sorry, I don't mean to like cut you
Oh
off.
no, you're good. Yeah.
Like it's such an important thing for Christians to understand other people's perspectives. Like that's why I do the podcast.
Yes.
Because a lot of people like who are on my podcast, they are Christians. They're not, most of them I feel like already have a faith in God. So a lot of like my testimony ones aren't necessarily reaching people who aren't Christian to, explain their side. So I want to have people on who have those different perspectives because it's like these are important perspectives for you to understand because A, it's going to strengthen your faith when you understand how other people are thinking, because then you're going to understand how to approach that. And also, it's
Mhm.
going to help you just understand where people are in order to talk to them about Jesus. Like, if you want to evangelize to somebody, you have to understand where they're coming from. You can't just be like, oh, these are the facts about Christianity. This is what Jesus says. When you don't understand, there are going to be aspects that they are either hurt from, there is going to be aspects that they already kind of understand, but they have a skewed understanding of it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's so important that we get those different perspectives because how are you actually going to be able to function in the world and trying to tell people about Jesus if you don't actually understand those other perspectives?
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I love that. I think that is an important part of our mission in the world of our calling as Christians that God has called us to do is to love other people. And one of the main ways we can do that is just by engaging in gentle, loving, respectful, honest, open conversation with them and doing that really well. Jesus spent a lot of his time on earth talking with people who thought really different thoughts. And
he was a radical.
he, he was a really radical dude. Yeah, he spent some time in for that day and age, some really crazy places. And I I would just say that like we need more Christians engaging in scientific thinking and conversations. We need more Christians to step in that arena and just listen and get to know scientists and realize like scientists are emotional people. Like we, cry when looking at stuff in a microscope because it's just so moving. And we um get really frustrated when we can't park the boat correctly. Like we're people. Like we're people who are sinners in need of a savior, just like everybody else. Sometimes as a Christian in science, I feel like the scientists are an unreached people group. Like we need more people to go into that field and engage in good, meaningful conversation and be in a relationship and get to know the thing that scientists love, get to know the science and do it. That's part of our mission too. So
Yeah.
thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
To answer, I think I answered the first part of your question, but to answer the second part. So the first part was what should Christians know about science? The second part was what should scientists know about, was it Christianity or about Christians?
Christianity.
About Christianity.
Or you could, either way.
Hmm, I would tell, what would I tell my science friends about Christianity? I would encourage them to not let Christians get in their way of knowing God. And by that I mean, like I said earlier, for a lot of my friends who have chosen not to believe in God or not to consider Christianity, they've often done so because a Christian or a group of Christians put a really great display of hypocrisy on in front of them. It just was really evident. And I would just like, I am a Christian. I'm also a hypocrite. I do not always represent Christ well. Sometimes I really screw it up. And um, I love the church. I love Christians, but we do not always, by any means, represent the gospel the way it was meant to be represented. I think sometimes we really, really misrepresent God. And so, to scientists who do not know and love God, I would just say, please don't let me get in the way of you finding out what truth actually is and engaging with a personal relationship with God. Like, you can do that and not have to be dependent on the example set to you by others. Like you can open the Bible, you can try multiple different churches because churches are composed of people and people are sinners and screw things up and are hypocrites, and no church is perfect, no person save Jesus is perfect. We're going to make mistakes, so please don't base your entire understanding of what the gospel is or of who God is and his character on me or on another Christian, because we are imperfect. Base it on Jesus. Go back to the source. Get to know who God actually is for yourself. Don't over rely on other Christians to be the perfect example of that for you, because we will at various points screw it up. And just my prayer for those people, for people who are scientists, who are curious about Christianity. I would encourage you the same way I just encouraged Christians, like get to know the science. I'd encourage you, get to know the Christians. Please don't be afraid of us. Like, please have conversations, but please also know that we are very imperfect. We screw things up a lot. We are not by any means perfect examples. And so please don't let us be a deterrent from you actually getting to know the truth and who God is.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Does that
Oh, yeah.
track?
Yeah,
Okay.
I like that because I think that that's so true. I had a conversation with another girl. Her name's Kennedy. We talked on a podcast episode. And we were just talking about that because she had gone through some church hurt, and she was just like, I don't want that to turn people away because the
Mm,
like Jesus is the savior, not us Christians. And so we
yeah.
want people to turn to Jesus. And so, but sometimes we don't do a great job at expressing who Jesus is. And anyway, we were just talking about also how though Jesus is probably the most church hurt person ever. Like
Oh my goodness.
he,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
so we were just kind of talking about that, but I think that that's so important is to be like, okay, we as Christians know we're going to mess up. We are never
Mhm.
going to be your perfect representation of Jesus that we should be. Like, I wish we were.
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
wish we were
We
the
need
perfect
to
representation.
do better. Like anybody who's looking at corporate Christianity and they're like, these people need to do better. Like, I agree. We do
Right?
need to do better.
Yeah.
But we're even while doing better, we're still gonna screw it up. Like
Yeah.
we're not perfect. Like so there's this part of Wesleyan theology that is this idea of entire sanctification. The concept, it's theoretical, but it's the concept that you could be so filled with the Holy Spirit that you could be operating out of such close and intimate relationship with your Creator that theoretically you would be walking in life without sin. I don't think anybody has ever actually achieved that. I think it's a concept. I think Jesus lived it out and was able to do so because he, as God, was in no need of sanctification. He was entirely sanctified already. But I want that for us as Christians. I want us to be the closest representation of Christ that we can possibly be. And so often we fall short of it. And for anybody who notices that, I just don't want it to be a deterrent. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. I have two more questions. One,
Yeah.
uh, is is there a marine biology like little story that you want to share that you've like something you've gone and done
Oh
or something
man.
like that?
Oh, there's so many. I okay, quick plug here. I have not released the title or done a public announcement yet. Maybe by the time this podcast goes live, you could check my Instagram, there might be one. But I am coming out with a book in approximately, I think a year is kind of the tentative
I will be buying
time frame.
it.
Thank you so much. I pursue traditional publishing, so I have a traditional publisher.
Know how
Um,
difficult that can be, so I'm proud of you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm honored and just absolutely blown away. I'm so excited to work with the team that I have. So anyways, that book that God willing will come out in about a year is filled to the brim with stories about my experience as a marine biologist, and it specifically describes what those stories taught me and can teach us about the character of God. So it's half really cool nature sciencey stories and half like a really deep dive nitty-gritty look at theology and how those two things connect. So it's really just like a massive wrap-up of this conversation we've been having, but with tons and tons of really neat marine biology stories. So
You're gonna have
depending
to
on when you're
on
listening
again.
to this, you'll definitely have to check that out. But in terms of like actual stories, so I mentioned this one in the book briefly. But when I was living and working in Australia, I had a field science opportunity to do some research on giant clams. And giant clams, the exact species I was working with is Tridacna gigas, gigas for like gigantic. And these clams were like 4 to 5 feet long, in terms of like from one end of their shell to the other. And you know, like if you order clams in a restaurant, how they're the little bivalve with the
Uh-huh.
hinged shells, their shells, like from one end to the other, were that long and just rugged, like this gray, ruggedy material, and just kind of splayed out open with so the body of a clam is called the mantle, and the mantle of these clams is bright this bright opalescent blue, just gorgeous, like sea blue, and it kind of like laid out over the edges of the shell. And it was covered, the mantle was covered with these iridescent green, purple, blue sequins, for lack of a better word, just these little tiny O-shaped dots, that just they weren't bioluminescent, but they reflected the light so brightly it was as if it was glowing. And the coolest part of these clams is that you could snorkel down and really gently, because you didn't want to hurt the clam, but you could tickle the mantle, just run your fingers across it like you're tickling it, and it would kind of shiver, and you could hear and feel the clam react while seeing it. So the the mantle has a siphon in it. It's the part of the clam that ejects water in order to hinge shut its shell. So the clam would react. The mantle would sort of creep back into the shell. The shell would sort of like crunch, like shove closed, and water would jet out of the siphon. And if you were snorkeling above it, tickling the clam, you would get a jet of water in your face. You'd hear this crunch sound as the shell started to come closed, and then it would sort of slowly shut together. And I spent I spent multiple afternoons just like snorkeling for hours, tickling giant clams and having the time of my life. It was such a blast. And it doesn't hurt the clam in any way. You just, gently touch them, and they would open up after about 5 minutes and be totally good to go again. You could just swim laps tickling clams. It was one of the funnest experiences of my life.
That is so fun. And I am so excited to read your book, okay? Like I'm gonna be on the
Aw,
lookout for a whole year until it's like here. Um,
thanks, friend.
but I know I write books. I have one coming out in May. And so
Oh, cool.
I do not traditional publish. I'm very much
Well, I
self-published.
did I did a little research on you, and I noticed you've got quite the backlist of books. You've published what, like three? Is
I have
that
two
right?
published right now, and
Two?
then my third one, which I grabbed out, this
Oh,
Keeps
cool.
Correcting Mistakes.
Oh, neat. And you
Um,
write fiction, right?
yeah.
Okay,
And so this
very
one
cool.
comes out May 25th. So
Awesome.
I'm very
What
excited.
what genre is it?
They're Christian fiction romance kind of. So
Okay, cool.
um I'd say the romance is a little more on the side. Like it's definitely not the
It's a
main
subplot.
topic. I
Mm,
definitely have a couple where it's the main plot, but I haven't published those. For these three, it's definitely a subplot because they're very much like hard topics being dealt with.
mm,
Um, which I enjoy writing so much more. I did write two just plain romance books, but I feel like I'm definitely someone who, if I write it that way, it's very short, it's very
mm,
sweet, and they do deal with other issues too, but they're much smaller.
yeah.
Whereas like these ones, they have some pretty big things going on, and then the two I just finished writing, like one of them deals with lust as the big issue, one of them deals with just
Mm,
doubts of God as the big issue, and so. It's so I love doing them because it's like those are things that like people deal with every single day.
yeah.
But they were definitely going to be shorter because they just didn't have the meat to them that I normally write, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
But yeah.
Yeah. So is this current book that's coming out, is it one of the meteor
Oh
book,
yeah,
like
it's
not
my
meteor like from the
longest.
sky, but like meaty or
Right. Yes, it's my longest book. It's over 400 pages.
Wow, that is a thick
But
one.
yeah, so it's a dual perspective. So there's a guy and a girl, and he gets them into a drunk driving accident, and he goes to juvie because he was underage drinking and driving, and she goes into a coma. And
Oh
so
my.
it's her life coming out of the coma and then his life in juvie and then coming out.
Okay.
It deals with a lot of big issues of like trauma and substance abuse is the biggest issue.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I think this is probably my favorite one. I love
Oh, that's neat. I
and
love that you're a writer.
thank you. And I designed my cover by myself. I pretty much did like
Wow, that's a
a lot
huge
more on
job.
this. So yeah, but
That's great. Well, it looks amazing.
thank
That's really cool. We
you.
should definitely link that below for
Oh,
listeners as well, since we're
I have
talking
them
about.
all. Right. I do have them because I always link my link tree in the
Oh
thing.
yeah,
And
brilliant.
so I have a spot on there that's called My Books. And then it'll bring you to my Amazon page, like my Amazon author page. So any book that
Okay,
I
cool.
write goes on there. So yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks for
I
sharing that.
and I have one last question for you, which is just
Yeah, what's
how
up?
can we be praying for you?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Thank you for asking that. That's so sweet. Um, I guess I could just really use prayer for like growing in greater understanding of and intimacy with God. Just like not gonna lie, some seasons are just kind of hard and just spiritually can kind of feel like a bit of a wash. Sometimes I feel just I can feel so incredibly close with the Lord, and I'm excited to open my Bible and spend time with Him and pray and engage in conversation with Him. And other seasons, which is a bit more like what I'm in right now, it's just it feels like a slog to do that, and I don't know what triggers my inconsistency so much. Like I want so badly to be steadfast in my approach to the Lord, and I am just incredibly inconsistent and anything but steadfast. And that's an area that I would like to change. I would like to be better, do better. So that's an area I could always use prayer.
Well, I will
How
definitely,
about, oh, thank you.
and I
How
know,
about for you?
oh,
Yeah, what can I pray
just
for you?
perseverance, I guess.
Mm,
Well, and I don't know. I don't like sometimes it's hard for me to like be specific about this when I ask for prayer. But just I'm trying to make my books and my podcast my full-time job. And so
wow, yeah.
just pray that that like actually starts to happen would be great. But thank you for asking. I've loved that you had like questions back for me. I thought that was so cool. So
Oh, well, thanks for being game. It was really fun to have kind of more of a conversation with you and talk about some of my favorite things. Thank you
yeah.
so much.
Well, I'd love to have you on again, especially like once your book comes out and everything. You should come
That'd
on
be
and talk.
awesome.
That'd be so cool.
I would love that. I'd love to be able to actually be like, here's the book. Like you
Right?
can get it now. Like
Yeah.
instead of this tease of like, oh yeah, there's going to be a book someday. Like there, I mean, God willing, there will be one, but
Yeah.
it's a ways off. So thanks.
That's
I
so cool
appreciate
though.
that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I had such a good time and I'm really excited to get this one out because it's not a
Yay.
perspective I've really gotten to explore until now. So it's really cool.
Is there any way for listeners if they wanted to like ask a question or something, is there a way that they can do that? I mean, I kind of told them already how they can contact me through my newsletter on
Yeah.
my website, but um if you want to send questions or whatever to me, I'd be happy to.
Thank you so much. I hope you have
Thank
a
you,
great rest of your
Lizzie.
day.
Thanks, you too. It was great meeting you.
Great meeting you too. I'll talk to you later.
Sounds good. Bye.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it because I definitely did. Rachel has so much insight and it was so nice to talk to her. So excited for her book to come out. You can follow her at the links below. I'll make sure to put them in there. Make sure you do follow her. She has such good content. And if you want to support the podcast, as always, there's so many ways to do that. The number one way to support the podcast is through joining the Patreon. It's $5 a month and really helps me to actually make the podcast my job, which is my hope and my goal. So, you get an extra episode every single week on there if you join. And then, of course, just praying for the podcast, sharing the episodes, and following us on Instagram, TikTok, Patreon, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the above. All of that will be linked in the show notes as well. So go follow those. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I'll see you guys next week, and God bless.